When 73-year-old Thomas walked into that courthouse, his hands shaking as he clutched evidence of corruption, the judge's cruel laughter filled the room. But Thomas's quiet words would shatter everything forever. The alarm clock buzzed at 4:30 a.m., just like it had every morning for the past 53 years. Thomas Martinez's weathered hand reached across the empty bed. Rosa's side had been cold for 18 months now, and silenced the persistent beeping. But today wasn't a work day in the strawberry fields. Today was the day he'd been dreading and preparing for in equal measure. At 73, Thomas's body told the story of 5 decades under the California sun. His hands, permanently stained brown from rich soil, bore calluses so thick they felt like leather. His back curved forward from years of bending over crops, and his knees creaked like old floorboards with every step. But his eyes, those deep brown eyes that had seen his children take their first steps and his wife take her last breath, burned with a determination that age couldn't diminish. He shuffled to the tiny kitchenette of his nephew's garage apartment, where he'd been living since they took his land. The coffee maker was a wedding gift from 1971, dented and discolored, but it still brewed the strong, black coffee that had sustained him through countless dawn mornings. As the familiar aroma filled the cramped space, Thomas opened the manila envelope he'd guarded like a treasure for 3 years. Inside were photocopies. So many photocopies. Each one cost him 10 cents at the public library, and he'd made dozens of trips, walking the 4 miles each way because bus fare was $15 he couldn't spare. There was the original deed from 1982, when he'd finally saved enough to buy the 2-acre plot that everyone said was worthless because it sat in a flood zone. There were tax receipts going back 41 years, each one proof that he'd never missed a payment, even during the lean years when the crops failed and Rosa was sick. The handwritten letter took up 3 pages in his careful elementary school cursive. English had never come naturally to a man who'd spoken only Spanish until he was 12, but he'd spent 6 months crafting every word, checking and rechecking with his niece Carmen, who was studying to be a teacher. Thomas dressed in his only good clothes, a white button-down shirt Rosa had ironed before she got too sick to stand, black slacks he'd worn to her funeral, and the brown leather shoes his son Miguel had sent from Afghanistan just weeks before the roadside bomb that brought him home in a flag-draped coffin. The bus ride to downtown took 45 minutes. 45 minutes of watching the city wake up around him. Business people in expensive cars talking on phones, joggers in designer athletic wear. The America his son had died defending, but that had never quite felt like it had room for people like Thomas. The Jefferson County Courthouse loomed before him like a marble mountain, its neoclassical columns and imposing stairs designed to make ordinary people feel small. Thomas climbed each step slowly, his arthritic knees protesting with every movement. Halfway up, he had to stop and rest, leaning against the cold stone balustrade while well-dressed lawyers streamed past him like he was invisible. Inside, the courthouse hummed with quiet efficiency. The lobby's polished marble floors reflected the faces of long-dead judges whose oil portraits lined the walls, all white men with stern expressions who looked like they'd never gotten dirt under their fingernails. The air conditioning was Arctic, and Thomas pulled his thin jacket tighter around his shoulders. "Can I help you?" The receptionist's voice carried that particular tone reserved for people who clearly didn't belong. She was young, maybe his granddaughter's age, with perfectly styled blonde hair and nails that had never seen a day of honest work. "I have court today," Thomas said quietly, his accent still thick after 38 years as an American citizen. "Martinez versus Hillcrest Development." She glanced at her computer screen with barely concealed impatience. "Court 3B, down the hall, 3rd door on your right." Thomas found the hallway lined with benches where other people waited for their cases to be called. There was a woman in a wrinkled dress clutching an eviction notice, an elderly man with a walker who kept checking his watch nervously, and several people who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else on earth. 20 minutes early, Thomas sat on a wooden bench that reminded him of the pews at St. Margaret's, where he'd married Rosa, where they'd baptized their children, where they'd said goodbye to Miguel. He closed his eyes and whispered the prayer his grandmother had taught him 70 years ago in the dusty village of Michoacán. "Dios, give me strength to face what I cannot change, and courage to change what I can." The corporate lawyers arrived like a small army, 3 men in identical dark suits, each carrying leather briefcases that probably cost more than Thomas made in a month. They spoke in low, confident voices about golf games and stock portfolios, occasionally glancing in Thomas's direction with barely concealed amusement. "Is that our plaintiff?" one of them asked, not bothering to lower his voice. "He doesn't look like he can afford to lose this case." Their laughter felt like needles in Thomas's chest, but he'd endured worse. He'd endured the factory supervisor who called him boy when he was 50 years old. He'd endured the bank officer who suggested he go back where he came from when he applied for his first loan. He'd endured the hospital administrator who asked if he was here legally while his wife was dying 3 floors above. When the bailiff finally called Martinez versus Hillcrest Development Corporation, Thomas's throat went dry. This was it. 3 years of preparation, 3 years of hoping, 3 years of believing that in America, justice was supposed to be blind. Judge Harrison Blackwell entered the courtroom with the bearing of a man who'd never questioned his place in the world. At 58, he was everything Thomas wasn't. Tall where Thomas was bent, pale where Thomas was sun-weathered, privileged where Thomas had clawed for every opportunity. His black robe flowed behind him like royal vestments, and his silver hair was styled to perfection despite the early hour. Judge Blackwell had graduated from Stanford Law, clerked for a federal appeals court judge, and spent his career handling cases for clients who summered in the Hamptons. This morning's docket was routine, a property dispute involving some immigrant who probably didn't even understand the legal system. He'd handled dozens of these cases, and they all ended the same way. "Your Honor," the lead attorney for Hillcrest Development stood with practiced confidence. "This is a straightforward matter of eminent domain. My client followed all statutory requirements in acquiring this property for a community development project that will bring jobs and tax revenue to Jefferson County." Judge Blackwell nodded, without looking up from his papers. He'd read the case summary. 2 acres of undeveloped land in a flood-prone area, acquired for a shopping center that would employ 300 people. The math was simple. Greater good trumped individual sentiment every time. "Mr. Martinez," the judge's voice filled the courtroom like thunder, "I see you're representing yourself today. Do you understand the nature of these proceedings?" Thomas stood slowly, his knees protesting audibly in the silent courtroom. Around him, he could feel eyes watching, judging, waiting for him to confirm their assumptions about his capabilities. "Yes, Your Honor," Thomas replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "I understand they took my land." A ripple of barely suppressed chuckles went through the corporate lawyers section. Even the court reporter glanced up with raised eyebrows. Judge Blackwell's expression remained impassive, but Thomas caught the slight tightening around his eyes, the look of a man already reaching his verdict. "Mr. Martinez, eminent domain is a well-established legal principle. The state has the authority to acquire private property for public use, provided the owner receives just compensation. What exactly is your complaint?" Thomas's hands trembled as he opened his manila envelope. Inside were 3 years of his life reduced to photocopies and handwritten notes. "Your Honor, they said the land was worth $12,000, but I know it was worth much more. I have papers." "Papers?" Judge Blackwell's voice carried a note of amusement that made several spectators shift uncomfortably. "Mr. Martinez, property valuation is conducted by licensed appraisers with advanced degrees and professional certification. Are you suggesting your opinion carries more weight than expert assessment?" The word opinion hung in the air like an insult. Thomas felt heat rise in his cheeks, but he pressed on. "Your Honor, I lived on that land for 42 years. I built everything with my own hands. The assessor, he never even got out of his car." "Mr. Martinez," Judge Blackwell interrupted, his patience clearly wearing thin. "This court operates on facts and law, not emotional attachment. Your sentimental connection to the property doesn't affect its market value." Thomas reached deeper into his envelope, pulling out a photograph so worn the edges had turned white. "Your Honor, this is my son Miguel. He died in Afghanistan defending this country. Before he left, he helped me plant an apple orchard on that land. Those trees, they were going to be his legacy." The courtroom fell silent. Even the corporate lawyers stopped shuffling their papers. Judge Blackwell glanced at the photograph with visible irritation. "Mr. Martinez, while I appreciate your family's sacrifice, military service doesn't create special property rights. The law applies equally to all citizens. Equal? The word escaped Thomas's lips before he could stop it. Excuse me? Thomas looked up at this man in black robes who held so much power over his life, and something inside him shifted. The fear was still there, but it was being overwhelmed by something stronger, a lifetime of quiet dignity finally finding its voice. I said equal, Your Honor. You say the law is equal for all citizens. But I wonder, when was the last time the government took land from someone who looked like you? The question hung in the air like smoke from a wildfire, thick and suffocating. Thomas's words. When was the last time the government took land from someone who looked like you? Echoed through the marble chamber, and for the first time in Judge Blackwell's career, he found himself genuinely speechless. A collective intake of breath swept through the gallery. The court reporter's fingers froze above her keyboard. Even the bailiff, a 20-year veteran who'd seen every kind of courtroom drama, shifted uncomfortably near the door. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, seated in the third row, felt her chest tighten. At 63, she'd lived through the civil rights movement, watched her own father struggle as a sharecropper in Alabama, seen too many good people crushed by systems that claimed to be fair. She gripped her purse handle until her knuckles went white. Judge Blackwell's face cycled through expressions like pages turning in a book. Surprise, indignation, calculation. His mouth opened twice before any sound emerged. Mr. Martinez, that question is inappropriate and irrelevant to these proceedings. But his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Something had shifted in the room's atmosphere, like the moment before a thunderstorm, when even the birds fall silent. Thomas remained standing, his weathered hands no longer trembling. Inappropriate, Your Honor, or just uncomfortable. The corporate lawyers exchanged glances. James Morrison, the lead attorney, touched his tie nervously, a tell he'd developed in law school whenever a case wasn't going according to script. He'd handled dozens of eminent domain cases, and they never went like this. The plaintiffs usually crumbled under judicial pressure, accepted their fate with resigned defeat. Mr. Martinez, Judge Blackwell's voice rose, attempting to regain control. You're out of order. This court, Thomas interrupted, his voice growing stronger with each word, took my land for a shopping center, not a hospital, not a school, not a road, a shopping center where rich people will buy things they don't need while I live in my nephew's garage. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Mrs. Patterson found herself nodding before she could stop herself. Behind her, an elderly man named Frank Kowalski, himself a veteran of property disputes with the city, whispered to his wife, "The old man's got a point." Judge Blackwell's gavel came down like a gunshot. Order. Mr. Martinez, you will confine your remarks to legal arguments, not social commentary. Thomas reached into his envelope again, his movements deliberate. This time he pulled out a letter so worn it looked like fabric. Your Honor, this is letter from my son Miguel, written 3 weeks before he died. You want to hear what American soldier wrote to his father? Mr. Martinez, personal correspondence is not admissible. Dad, Thomas began reading, his accent making the English words sound like a prayer. I think about our land every day, about the apple trees we planted together, about Mom's rose garden. I think about how you taught me that in America. If you work hard and play by the rules, you can build something that lasts, something to pass down to your children. The courtroom had gone cemetery quiet. Judge Blackwell found himself leaning forward despite his intention to remain detached. Thomas continued, his voice cracking but never stopping. I'm fighting for that America, Dad. The America where it doesn't matter where your grandparents were born or what your last name is. Where justice isn't just for people who can afford fancy lawyers. I'm fighting so that when I come home, we can sit under those apple trees and know that our piece of America is safe. The silence that followed was profound. Mrs. Patterson felt tears threatening behind her reading glasses. Frank Kowalski removed his cap and held it against his chest. Even the court reporter found herself blinking rapidly. Judge Blackwell cleared his throat, but when he spoke, his voice sounded different, smaller somehow. Mr. Martinez, while your son's service is commendable, it doesn't change the legal facts of this case. Legal facts, Thomas repeated, folding the letter carefully. Your Honor, my son died believing in legal facts. He died believing America keeps its promises to people like us. The corporate lawyer shifted in his seat, glancing at his watch. This was taking too long. Property disputes weren't supposed to become philosophical discussions about American values. But Thomas wasn't finished. He pulled out another document, this one crisp and official-looking. Your Honor, this is copy of letter from County Assessor, written 2 years before they took my land. Says my property worth $48,000 minimum. Judge Blackwell's eyebrows rose involuntarily. Let me see that. As Thomas approached the bench, his worn work boots clicking on the marble floor, several people in the gallery craned their necks to get a better view. The corporate lawyers huddled together, whispering urgently. Judge Blackwell studied the document, and Thomas watched his face carefully. For a moment, the judge's mask slipped, revealing something that might have been doubt. This assessment, Judge Blackwell began, then stopped himself. Says $48,000 minimum, Thomas repeated. They gave me 12. Your Honor, even an old farm worker can do that math. Mrs. Patterson gasped audibly. Frank Kowalski muttered something under his breath that sounded like highway robbery. The murmur that followed was louder this time, harder to ignore. Morrison, the corporate lawyer, stood quickly. Your Honor, the plaintiff is attempting to relitigate a matter that was properly decided by certified appraisers. The county assessment he's citing is from before the flood zone designation changed. Judge Blackwell looked from the document to Thomas to the gallery of faces watching his every move. He felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years on the bench. Genuine uncertainty about the righteousness of his position. Mr. Martinez, he said finally, property values fluctuate based on many factors. Flood zone designations, zoning changes, market conditions. Market conditions, Thomas nodded slowly. Like when big corporation decides it wants your land for shopping center. That kind of market condition? The question was razor-sharp in its simplicity. Judge Blackwell found himself in the uncomfortable position of a man who'd spent his career believing his own rhetoric about impartial justice, suddenly faced with its contradictions. Your Honor, Thomas continued, pulling out yet another document. This is letter from Hillcrest Development, written 6 months before they filed for eminent domain, offering to buy my land for $60,000. The corporate lawyers went rigid. Morrison's face had gone pale. $60,000 when they wanted to buy, Thomas said, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom like a bell. $12,000 when government says they can take. Judge Blackwell stared at the document, feeling the weight of 30 pairs of eyes on him. This wasn't how these cases were supposed to go. There weren't supposed to be smoking guns. There weren't supposed to be moments when the entire legal edifice revealed its human flaws. Your Honor, Morrison interjected desperately, that private offer was made under different circumstances. Different circumstances, Thomas repeated, turning to face the lawyer. You mean circumstances where I could say no? The simple truth of it hit the courtroom like a physical force. Mrs. Patterson felt her heart racing. This wasn't just about one old man's land anymore. This was about every time the powerful had used the law as a weapon against the powerless. Judge Blackwell set down the document and removed his reading glasses, rubbing his eyes. For a moment he looked not like a figure of judicial authority but like a tired man confronting uncomfortable truths. Mr. Martinez, he said quietly, what exactly are you asking this court to do? Thomas straightened his shoulders, and in that moment, everyone in the courtroom could see not the bent old farm worker, but the young man who'd crossed a desert for the promise of America, who'd worked sunup to sundown for 40 years, who'd raised children to believe in justice. I'm asking for what my son died believing in, Your Honor. I'm asking for America to keep its promises. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of possibility, heavy with the weight of a moment when everything could change direction. Judge Blackwell sat in that silence, feeling the gravity of a decision that would define not just this case, but his own understanding of the man he'd become. Outside the courtroom windows, morning was giving way to afternoon, and the quality of light had changed from harsh to golden. Inside, something else was shifting too, something that had been building from the moment Thomas Martinez first asked when the government had last taken land from someone who looked like the judge. The answer to that question hung unspoken in the air, and everyone in the courtroom knew what it was. The afternoon light streaming through the tall courthouse windows had shifted, casting longer shadows across the marble floor. Judge Blackwell sat frozen in his leather chair, the weight of Thomas's evidence spreading through the courtroom like ripples in still water. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. Mrs. Patterson found herself holding her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd seen injustice before, lived through it, survived it, but watching it unfold in real time felt different. More personal, more urgent. "Your Honor," Morrison's voice cracked slightly as he rose, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. He tugged at his collar, a thin film of perspiration visible on his forehead despite the courthouse's aggressive air conditioning. "These documents, they're taken out of context. The original offer was conditional, subject to zoning approval and environmental assessments." Thomas turned slowly to face the corporate lawyer, and something in his expression made Morrison take an involuntary step backward. "Conditional," Thomas repeated, his voice carrying a new authority that filled every corner of the room. "Like my son's life was conditional, like my citizenship is conditional, like my right to justice is conditional." The gallery stirred restlessly. Frank Kowalski leaned forward in his seat, his weathered hands gripping the pew back in front of him. Behind him, a young mother named Sarah Chen shifted her sleeping toddler to her other arm, thinking of her own immigrant grandparents who'd lost everything twice, once to war, once to urban renewal. Judge Blackwell cleared his throat, the sound echoing hollowly in the charged atmosphere. "Mr. Martinez, while these documents raise questions about the valuation process, they don't necessarily invalidate the eminent domain proceedings." But his voice lacked conviction now. Each word sounded like it was being pulled from him against his will. Thomas reached into his envelope one final time, his movements deliberate and sure. What he withdrew made Morrison go absolutely rigid, a manila folder thick with papers, photos, and what looked like correspondence. "Your Honor, there's something else you need to see." The courthouse clock chimed twice, marking the passage of hours that felt like years. Thomas opened the folder carefully, like he was handling something sacred and terrible at the same time. "This is photograph of City Council meeting from last winter," Thomas said, holding up a grainy image that looked like it had been enlarged from a cell phone video. "Meeting where they voted to approve Hillcrest Development's project." Morrison shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is completely irrelevant to the compensation question." "Sit down," Judge Blackwell said quietly, surprising everyone, including himself. Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger with each revelation. "This man here," he pointed to a figure in the photograph, "is Councilman Robert Hayes. He voted yes for the project." "So?" Morrison demanded, though sweat was now clearly visible on his brow. Thomas pulled out another document. "This is business registration. Shows Councilman Hayes is silent partner in construction company that got contract to build the shopping center." The courtroom erupted. Not in chaos, but in that particular kind of stunned murmur that happens when people witness something they suspected but hoped wasn't true. Mrs. Patterson gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth. Frank Kowalski muttered something in Polish that didn't need translation. Judge Blackwell's face had gone pale. "Mr. Martinez, these are serious allegations." "Not allegations, Your Honor. Facts." Thomas's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Here is copy of bank records. Shows payment from Hillcrest Development to Hayes Construction, same week as council vote." Morrison was frantically shuffling through his papers now, his confident demeanor completely shattered. "Your Honor, even if there were irregularities in the approval process, that doesn't affect the legal validity of the eminent domain action itself." "Doesn't it?" Thomas asked, and the simplicity of the question was devastating. Judge Blackwell found himself staring at documents that painted a picture he didn't want to see. He'd built his career on the assumption that the system, while imperfect, was fundamentally just, that the law, properly applied, protected everyone equally. But here, spread across his bench like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, was evidence of something much uglier. "Your Honor," Thomas said, his voice softer now but somehow more powerful, "my son Miguel, he wrote me another letter." Want to know what he said? Without waiting for permission, Thomas pulled out a second letter, this one even more worn than the first. He said, "Dad, sometimes I wonder if we're fighting for the right America. Not the America that exists, but the America that should exist. The America where a man's worth isn't measured by his accent or his bank account, but by the content of his character." Mrs. Patterson felt tears sliding down her cheeks. She thought of her own father, who died believing that America would eventually live up to its promises, of her husband, who'd worked 2 jobs for 30 years and never complained, of herself sitting in this courtroom, watching an old man fight for dignity with nothing but truth as his weapon. Miguel wrote that letter the day before he died, Thomas continued, his voice breaking slightly. He died believing in an America where justice isn't for sale, where city councilmen don't sell votes to the highest bidder, where judges, he looked directly at Judge Blackwell, where judges remember they serve justice, not power. The silence that followed was profound and terrible. Judge Blackwell felt the weight of every decision he'd ever made, every shortcut he'd taken, every time he'd chosen the path of least resistance over the path of righteousness. Morrison tried one last, desperate gambit. Your Honor, regardless of these peripheral issues, the law is clear. Eminent domain? The law, Thomas interrupted, his voice now carrying the authority of absolute moral clarity, is supposed to protect people like me from people like you. He turned to address the entire courtroom, his bent frame somehow seeming taller than everyone else in the room. 42 years ago, I came to this country with nothing but hope. I worked in fields under sun that could kill you. I saved every penny. I bought land nobody wanted because it flooded sometimes. I made it beautiful. I made it home. His voice cracked with emotion, but he pressed on. They told me this was America, where if you work hard and follow rules, you can build something that lasts, something to pass to your children. But now I understand. Those rules only protect some people. Justice only works for some people. The American dream only belongs to some people. Mrs. Patterson was openly crying now, thinking of all the times she'd witnessed this same story. Good people crushed by systems designed to protect the powerful. Frank Kowalski had removed his cap entirely, holding it against his chest like he was attending a funeral. Judge Blackwell looked at Thomas Martinez, really looked at him, and saw not a problematic plaintiff to be dismissed, but a human being whose life had been casually destroyed by the very system Blackwell had sworn to uphold. Mr. Martinez, he said quietly, what do you want me to do? Thomas straightened his shoulders, and for a moment, everyone could see the young man who'd crossed a desert for the promise of America, who'd raised children to believe in justice, who'd sent his son to die for ideals that seemed increasingly hollow. I want you to give me back my land, Thomas said simply. I want you to tell Hillcrest Development that they can't buy city councilmen and steal from old men. I want you to remember that justice is supposed to be blind, not deaf and dumb. He paused, looking around the courtroom at all the faces watching him. But most of all, Your Honor, I want you to help me believe my son didn't die for nothing. The courtroom was dead silent. Outside, the afternoon was fading toward evening, and the golden light slanting through the windows seemed to illuminate not just the room, but the moral choice that lay before everyone in it. Judge Blackwell sat with the weight of 30 years of compromises and convenient blindness pressing down on him like a physical force. In his hands were documents that proved what everyone had always known but never wanted to acknowledge, that the system was rigged, that justice was for sale, that the American dream had a price tag most people couldn't afford. Morrison was gathering his papers with the desperate efficiency of a man whose world was collapsing. The other corporate lawyers sat in stunned silence, realizing that their routine victory had somehow transformed into something else entirely. Mrs. Patterson wiped her eyes with a tissue, thinking of her grandchildren and wondering what kind of America they would inherit. Frank Kowalski put his cap back on and straightened his shoulders, feeling something he hadn't felt in years: hope. And Thomas Martinez stood in the center of it all, a bent old man who'd somehow found the strength to speak truth to power, waiting to see if America was ready to live up to its promises. The next words spoken in that courtroom would change everything. Judge Blackwell's hands trembled as he set down the damning documents. The courtroom held its collective breath, suspended in that terrible moment between accusation and judgment, between the old way of doing things and something that might resemble justice. The afternoon sun had shifted again, now streaming directly through the tall windows behind the judge's bench, casting him in silhouette against the golden light. To Mrs. Patterson, sitting in the gallery with tears still wet on her cheeks, it looked almost biblical, like a man standing at the gates of his own judgment. 30 seconds passed, then 60. The silence stretched until it became physically uncomfortable. broken only by the distant hum of traffic outside and the barely audible whisper of the air conditioning. Frank Kowalski shifted in his seat, the leather creaking softly. Sarah Chen's toddler stirred in her arms, but remained mercifully asleep. Judge Blackwell removed his reading glasses and rubbed his eyes. When he opened them again, he looked like a man who'd aged a decade in the span of an afternoon. "Bailiff," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "clear the courtroom of all non-essential personnel." Morrison's head snapped up. "Your Honor, this is a public proceeding. Now!" Judge Blackwell's voice cracked like a whip, startling everyone. The bailiff moved immediately, but Mrs. Patterson found herself frozen in place. She couldn't leave. Not now. Not when history was being made in real time. The bailiff approached her row. "Ma'am, you'll need to—" "She stays," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying surprising authority. "They all stay. Truth doesn't need to hide in shadows." Judge Blackwell looked at Thomas for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "The bailiff will remain. Everyone else stays." Morrison was frantically whispering to his associates, their earlier confidence completely evaporated. One of them was already packing his briefcase, as if preparing for a hasty retreat. Judge Blackwell stood up slowly, his black robe rustling in the oppressive silence. He walked to the window, his back to the courtroom, his silhouette stark against the afternoon light. 23 years ago, he began, his voice so quiet that everyone strained to hear. "I was sworn in as a judge in this courthouse. Do you know what I promised that day, Mr. Martinez?" Thomas remained standing, his weathered hands folded in front of him. "Tell me, Your Honor." "I promised to uphold justice without regard to persons, rich or poor, powerful or powerless, native-born or immigrant." Judge Blackwell's voice cracked slightly. "I promised my wife, my children, my community, that I would be better than the system that came before me." Mrs. Patterson felt fresh tears threatening. This wasn't the arrogant judge who'd entered the courtroom hours earlier. This was a man confronting the wreckage of his own ideals. "Somewhere along the way," Judge Blackwell continued, still facing the window, "I convinced myself that expedience was the same as justice, that maintaining order was more important than asking difficult questions, that people like you, Mr. Martinez, would find a way to manage." He turned around slowly, and the transformation was startling. Gone was the imperial bearing, the casual authority. What remained was a man stripped bare of pretense, holding the broken pieces of his own conscience. "Mr. Martinez," Judge Blackwell said, his voice growing stronger, "you asked me when was the last time the government took land from someone who looked like me. The answer is never. Never in my lifetime. Never in my father's lifetime. Probably never in this county's entire history." The admission hit the courtroom like a physical force. Frank Kowalski leaned forward, his mouth slightly open. Sarah Chen shifted her sleeping child, her eyes wide with disbelief. Morrison shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. If you're having doubts about the legal framework—" "Sit down, counselor," Judge Blackwell said, and there was steel in his voice now. "I'm not having doubts about the legal framework. I'm having a reckoning with my own soul." The lawyer remained standing, his face flushed with desperation. "Your Honor, regardless of any personal feelings, the law is clear. Eminent domain—" "The law," Judge Blackwell interrupted, his voice rising, "is supposed to serve justice, not the other way around. When the law becomes a tool for the powerful to steal from the powerless, then the law has failed its most basic purpose." Thomas felt something breaking open in his chest. Not pain this time, but something that might have been hope. After 42 years in America, after watching his son die for ideals that seemed increasingly hollow, he was witnessing something he'd almost stopped believing in, the possibility of redemption. Judge Blackwell walked back to his bench, but instead of sitting down, he remained standing, his hands resting on the polished wood. "Mr. Martinez, I want you to understand something. What I'm about to do will likely end my career. There will be appeals, investigations, probably criminal charges for some of the people involved in this conspiracy. But you know what?" Thomas shook his head, not trusting his voice to work. "I have to live with myself. I have to look my grandchildren in the eye someday and tell them what I stood for when it mattered most." Mrs. Patterson found herself gripping the pew so tightly, her knuckles had gone white. This was it. This was the moment when one man's courage could change everything. Furthermore, Judge Blackwell continued, his voice gaining strength with each word, the evidence presented today reveals a pattern of corruption so extensive that it calls into question not just this eminent domain action, but potentially dozens of others. Morrison's face had gone ashen. Your Honor, you can't possibly— Can't what, Counselor? Can't do my job? Can't uphold the oath I took? Can't protect citizens from predatory corporations and corrupt officials? The judge's voice was building now, carrying the weight of 23 years of compromise and moral cowardice, finally finding its way to the surface. This court finds that the eminent domain action against Thomas Martinez was fraudulent from its inception. The compensation offered was artificially deflated through collusion between Hillcrest Development and corrupt city officials. The public purpose claimed for this taking was a sham designed to enrich private parties at the expense of an honest, hard-working American citizen. The words rang out like bells in the marble chamber. Mrs. Patterson felt her heart soaring, thinking of her father who'd never lived to see justice like this. Frank Kowalski removed his cap again, this time in respect rather than grief. Therefore, Judge Blackwell continued, his voice now carrying the full authority of his office, the court hereby invalidates the eminent domain action. Mr. Martinez, your land will be returned to you, along with compensation for the forced displacement you have endured. Thomas's knees nearly gave out. 42 years of dreams, seemingly destroyed forever, suddenly restored with the power of words spoken in truth. But Judge Blackwell wasn't finished. Moreover, this court is ordering an immediate investigation into the actions of Councilman Hayes and any other officials involved in this conspiracy. The evidence suggests criminal violations that go far beyond civil property disputes. Morrison was gathering his papers with shaking hands, his entire case collapsing around him like a house of cards. Your Honor, we will appeal this decision immediately. Appeal all you want, Counselor, Judge Blackwell said calmly. But while you're doing that, explain to your clients how they're going to defend charges of fraud, bribery, and conspiracy to violate civil rights under federal law. The threat hit Morrison like a sledgehammer. Federal charges meant FBI investigations, meant national attention, meant the kind of scrutiny that could destroy careers and send people to prison. Thomas stood in the center of the courtroom, feeling like a man who'd been underwater for 3 years and had finally been allowed to breathe. But more than the land, more than the money, more than the vindication, he felt something else, the restoration of his faith in the America his son had died defending. Your Honor, Thomas said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. May I say something? Judge Blackwell nodded. When my son Miguel was little boy, he asked me why I came to America. I told him it was because in America truth matters more than power. Justice matters more than money. That ordinary people can stand up to big companies and corrupt politicians and win. Thomas paused, looking around the courtroom at all the faces watching him. For a long time I thought I lied to my son. I thought I filled his head with stories that weren't true. But today you showed me that America I told him about still exists. It just took courage to find it. Judge Blackwell's eyes filled with tears he didn't try to hide. Mr. Martinez, you didn't lie to your son. You just reminded the rest of us what we're supposed to be. The courtroom erupted in applause. Not the polite clapping of a formal proceeding, but the kind of raw, emotional ovation that happens when people witness something they'll remember for the rest of their lives. Mrs. Patterson was sobbing openly now, thinking of all the times injustice had won, all the times good people had been crushed by systems too big and too powerful to fight. But not today. Today, one brave old man and one conscience-stricken judge had proven that sometimes, just sometimes, David could still beat Goliath. As the applause died down, Judge Blackwell banged his gavel one final time. This court is adjourned. Mr. Martinez, go home, your real home, the one you built with your own hands. And for the first time in 3 years, Thomas Martinez smiled. 3 weeks had passed since the courthouse eruption that changed everything. The autumn air carried a crispness that spoke of endings and beginnings, and Thomas Martinez stood at the edge of his reclaimed land, watching the morning sun paint everything gold. The bulldozers were gone. The construction equipment that had scarred his 2 acres for months had been hauled away, leaving behind churned earth that looked like a battlefield after the war had ended. But it was his battlefield now, his victory, his home. Thomas knelt down and picked up a handful of the disturbed soil, letting it run through his fingers the way he had as a child in his grandmother's garden in Michoacán. The earth smelled the same here as it had there, rich, alive, full of possibility. Some things, he realized, transcended borders and heartbreak. Behind him, his nephew Carlos approached with 2 steaming cups of coffee, his footsteps careful on the uneven ground. At 35, Carlos had inherited his uncle's strong hands, but not his patience. He'd spent weeks trying to convince Thomas to sell the land to another developer and retire somewhere comfortable. "Tio," Carlos said, offering one of the cups. "The reporter from Channel 7 is here again. She wants to do another interview about the corruption scandal." Thomas accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping his weathered hands around the warm ceramic. The media attention had been overwhelming. National news outlets, documentary filmmakers, book agents all wanting to tell his story. They called him a hero, a symbol, an inspiration. The words felt heavy and foreign, like clothes that didn't fit properly. "Tell her no, mijo. I said what I needed to say in court." Carlos shifted uncomfortably, kicking at a clod of earth. "Tio, she says they want to make you famous. Book deals, speaking tours, maybe even a movie. You could be rich." The word hung between them like smoke. Rich. Thomas had been poor for so long that wealth seemed like a concept from another planet, something that happened to other people in other lives. "I don't want to be rich, Carlos. I want to be home. But Tio, this land, it's all torn up. It'll take years to fix, and you're 73 years old. Wouldn't it be easier to—" "Easier," Thomas repeated, tasting the word like it was medicine. "Yes, it would be easier. Selling would be easier. Moving to a retirement home would be easier. Staying quiet in that courtroom would have been easier." He paused, watching a red-tailed hawk circle overhead, hunting for field mice in the disturbed soil. But easy and right are not the same thing, mijo. Across town, in the courthouse that had become the unlikely stage for a small revolution, Judge Harrison Blackwell was cleaning out his office. The ethics investigation had been swift and thorough, clearing him of any wrongdoing but making his position untenable nonetheless. Powerful people didn't forget judges who upset their carefully constructed systems. His secretary, Mrs. Helen Thompson, knocked gently on the doorframe. At 62, she'd worked for 3 different judges and had seen enough courthouse drama to fill several novels, but nothing had prepared her for the aftermath of the Martinez case. "Judge Blackwell, there's someone here to see you. If it's another reporter, it's Mrs. Patterson, Eleanor Patterson. She was in the gallery during the Martinez hearing." Judge Blackwell looked up from the box he was packing, his expression puzzled. "I don't understand. Does she have a case before the court?" Mrs. Thompson shook her head, her gray curls bouncing slightly. "She says she just wants to thank you." Eleanor Patterson entered the office carrying a plate covered with a blue checkered cloth, her hands trembling slightly with what might have been nervousness or emotion. At 63, she'd raised 4 children, buried a husband, and survived a dozen family crises. But facing this man who'd risked everything for principle felt somehow momentous. "Judge Blackwell, I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I brought you some cookies, oatmeal raisin, my grandmother's recipe." Judge Blackwell gestured to the chair across from his desk, his formal manner softened by genuine curiosity. "Please sit. Mrs. Patterson, isn't it? I remember you from the hearing." Eleanor settled into the chair, smoothing her dress nervously. "I've been thinking about that day for weeks now, about what you did, what it meant. What I did was my job, Mrs. Patterson. Nothing more." "No," she said firmly, surprising them both with her vehemence. "What you did was choose conscience over convenience, truth over politics, that old man over your own career." Judge Blackwell removed his reading glasses and rubbed his eyes, suddenly looking every one of his 58 years. "Mrs. Patterson, I spent 23 years on this bench making the safe choice, the easy choice, the choice that kept everyone comfortable. One moment of moral clarity doesn't erase decades of moral cowardice." Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Judge Blackwell, do you have children?" "2 daughters, both grown now." "Then you understand. What we do in the moments that matter most, that's what our children remember." That's what they carry forward into their own lives. She paused, reaching into her purse for a worn photograph. This is my father, Samuel Patterson. He was a sharecropper in Alabama during the Depression, worked land that wasn't his for people who didn't respect him, never owned more than the clothes on his back. Judge Blackwell studied the faded black and white image of a man in overalls, standing beside a mule, his face weathered but dignified. When I was 12, Eleanor continued, the landowner tried to cheat my father out of his share of the cotton crop. Said the books showed we owed money instead of earning it. My father couldn't read, but he wasn't stupid. He knew those numbers were wrong. What did he do? He walked 20 miles to the county courthouse, stood in line for 6 hours to speak to a judge. Probably the first time in his life he'd ever set foot in a building that fancy. Eleanor's voice grew softer, more reflective. The judge, a white man in Alabama in the 1930s, he could have dismissed my father without a second thought, could have had him thrown out, or worse. But he didn't. He listened. He looked at those books, and he ruled in my father's favor. Judge Blackwell felt something tighten in his chest. What happened then? My father got his money, enough to buy a little plot of land of his own. Nothing fancy, just a few acres where he could grow vegetables and raise chickens. But it was his. Eleanor wiped her eyes with a tissue she'd pulled from her purse. My father lived on that land for 40 years, raised 8 children there, saw 23 grandchildren take their first steps in that dirt. And every single one of us grew up knowing that sometimes, just sometimes, the system works the way it's supposed to. The office fell silent, except for the distant sounds of courthouse business, phones ringing, footsteps in hallways, the low murmur of legal proceedings continuing their eternal dance. Mrs. Patterson, Judge Blackwell said finally, why are you telling me this? Because what you did for Mr. Martinez is the same thing that Judge did for my father. You reminded us that justice isn't just a word carved in marble. It's a choice real people make in real moments when it would be easier to look the other way. Eleanor stood up, smoothing her dress again. My father died believing in America because one judge had the courage to do what was right instead of what was convenient. Now my grandchildren will grow up with that same faith because of what you did. She paused at the door, turning back with a smile that transformed her entire face. Judge Blackwell, you may have lost your job, but you found something much more valuable. You found yourself. After she left, Judge Blackwell sat alone in his half-empty office, holding the plate of cookies and thinking about legacy, about the moments that define a life, about the difference between a career and a calling. Outside his window, autumn was painting the world in shades of gold and crimson, and for the first time in months, Harrison Blackwell felt something that might have been peace. 2 months after the courthouse victory, Thomas Martinez knelt in the rich soil of his reclaimed land, his arthritic fingers gently pressing apple seeds into the earth. The morning air carried the scent of approaching winter, but there was warmth in the work, purpose in each carefully placed seed. His granddaughter Maria crouched beside him, her small hands mimicking his movements with the careful precision of a 7-year-old taking on an important task. She'd driven up from Los Angeles with her mother Elena, Thomas's daughter who'd finally found the courage to bring her child to see the land that had nearly been lost forever. Abuelo, Maria asked, her voice filled with the wonder that only children possess. Will these really grow into trees like the ones Papa Miguel planted? Thomas paused, a seed suspended between his thumb and forefinger, thinking of his son who would never see these trees bear fruit. Sí, mi amor, but it will take time, maybe 10 years before we see apples. That's forever, Maria giggled, pressing her seed into the soft earth with exaggerated care. Forever is different when you're old, mija. Thomas smiled, watching his granddaughter's face scrunch up in concentration. When you're my age, 10 years feels like tomorrow. Elena sat on the old wooden bench Thomas had rebuilt from memory, the same bench where he and Rosa used to watch the sunset after long days in the fields. At 38, she carried the quiet strength of a woman who'd learned to navigate life, without the father who'd died too young and the husband who'd left when military benefits ran out. Papa, Elena said, her voice carrying that particular blend of love and exasperation that daughters reserve for their fathers. You know you don't have to plant the whole orchard yourself. Carlos found contractors who could— No contractors, Thomas interrupted gently, his hands never stopping their work. These trees, they need to know who planted them. They need to feel the love in the soil. Elena shook her head, but she was smiling. Her father had always believed that plants could sense human emotion, that gardens grew better when tended by happy hands. It was one of the many things she'd dismissed as old country superstition until she'd started her own small herb garden in her Los Angeles apartment and found herself talking to the basil plants. Across the property, near the spot where Rosa's rose garden was slowly being restored, Judge Harrison Blackwell stood with his hands in his pockets, watching the Martinez family work. He'd called ahead, asking if he could visit, and Thomas had surprised everyone by saying yes. The former judge looked different in civilian clothes, smaller somehow, more human. The imperial bearing was gone, replaced by something that might have been humility. His silver hair was still perfectly styled, but his expensive suit had been traded for jeans and a simple button-down shirt that made him look like any other man approaching 60. Thomas noticed him standing there and rose slowly, brushing dirt from his knees. The two men approached each other across the scarred but healing land, their footsteps careful on the uneven ground. "Mr. Martinez," Judge Blackwell said, his voice carrying none of its former authority. "Thank you for letting me come." "Judge Blackwell." Thomas nodded, then paused, studying the other man's face. "Or do I still call you Judge? Harrison is fine. I'm not a judge anymore." They stood in awkward silence for a moment. Two men whose lives had intersected in the most unlikely way, forever changed by a collision of conscience and circumstance. "I wanted to apologize," Harrison said finally, his words coming slowly, as if each one carried weight, not just for the way I treated you in court, but for the 23 years before that, for all the times I chose comfort over courage. Thomas looked at this man who'd once held his future in contemptuous hands, now reduced to seeking forgiveness from an old farm worker. "You already gave me back my land, Harrison. What more do you think you owe me?" "Honesty," Harrison replied without hesitation. "The truth about why it took your courage to make me remember my own." Elena looked up from her bench, watching the two men with the careful attention of someone witnessing history in the making. Maria continued planting seeds, humming softly to herself, oblivious to the weight of the moment unfolding around her. "You want to know the truth?" Thomas asked, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the still air. "The truth is, I was scared to death in that courtroom. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold my papers." Harrison's eyebrows rose in surprise. "But you know what scared me more than losing?" Thomas continued, kneeling down to plant another seed. "What scared me more was the thought that Miguel died for nothing, that the America he believed in, the America I taught him to love, was just a beautiful lie." Harrison felt something crack open in his chest, a pain that was somehow cleaner than the dull ache of self-recrimination he'd carried for months. "When you laughed at me in that courtroom," Thomas said, his voice growing stronger, "when you called my life's work a garden or whatever, I felt something break inside me, but not just sadness, anger, real anger." He looked up at Harrison, his weathered hands still working the soil. "I realized that staying quiet wasn't protecting my dignity. It was betraying it. That letting powerful people steal from ordinary people without consequence wasn't keeping the peace. It was enabling evil." The words hung in the air between them, simple and devastating in their truth. "Mr. Martinez." "Thomas," Harrison said, his voice thick with emotion. "Do you know what you taught me?" Thomas shook his head, genuinely curious. "You taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right because it's right, even when you're terrified, even when it costs you everything." Harrison knelt down in the dirt beside Thomas, his expensive jeans immediately staining with soil. "You taught me that a man's worth isn't measured by the power he holds, but by what he does with it when it matters most." Elena watched these two unlikely men working side by side in the earth, their hands dark with soil, their conversation punctuated by the small sounds of planting and the distant laughter of her daughter. There was something profound happening here, something that had nothing to do with legal victories or media attention, and everything to do with the simple act of human beings seeing each other clearly. "Harrison," Thomas said, pressing another seed into the earth, "can I tell you something my grandmother told me when I was Maria's age? Please." She said that every seed we plant is an act of faith. Faith that tomorrow will come. Faith that the sun will shine and the rain will fall. Faith that someone will be there to harvest what we're too old to see. Thomas paused, looking at his granddaughter, who was now making elaborate patterns in the dirt with a stick. She also said that the most important seeds we plant aren't in the ground. They're in the hearts of our children. The seeds of kindness, of courage, of standing up for what's right even when it's hard. Harrison felt tears threatening behind his reading glasses. Thomas, I don't have much time left to plant seeds like that. How old are your daughters? 35 and 32. Both have children of their own. Thomas smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. Then you have grandchildren, Harrison. Seeds don't have expiration dates. Maria looked up from her dirt patterns, noticing the strange man kneeling in her grandfather's garden. Abuelo, who's your friend? Thomas and Harrison exchanged glances, and something passed between them that transcended their impossible history. This is Harrison, mija. He's someone who helped Abuelo remember something very important. What did you remember, Abuelo? Thomas picked up his granddaughter, soil and all, holding her against his chest, as he had her father 30 years before. I remembered that in America, when good people stand together, impossible things become possible. Maria wrinkled her nose thoughtfully. Like magic? Better than magic, mi amor, like truth. As the sun climbed higher in the autumn sky, 3 generations worked side by side with a man who'd once been their enemy, planting seeds in soil that had been fought for, died for, and finally reclaimed through the simple act of one old man refusing to be silent. Elena watched her father teaching her daughter the same lessons he'd once taught her. That dignity can't be taken, only surrendered. That justice delayed is not always justice denied. That sometimes the most powerful thing an ordinary person can do is stand up and speak truth to power. But more than that, she watched 2 men who'd been on opposite sides of a fundamental divide finding common ground in the most literal sense, their hands in the same earth, planting seeds for a future they might not live to see but believed in anyway. As they worked, Thomas began to sing softly, an old Mexican folk song his grandmother had taught him about seeds and seasons, about patience and hope. Harrison didn't know the words, but he hummed along anyway, and Maria giggled at the sound of the 2 old men making music in the dirt. The song carried across the healing land, mixing with the sound of the wind in the trees Miguel had planted and the distant hum of traffic from the world beyond. It was the sound of home being rebuilt, not just with lumber and stone, but with forgiveness and understanding and the radical act of choosing hope over bitterness. And in that moment, surrounded by family and former enemies turned friends, Thomas Martinez felt something he hadn't experienced since the day they'd taken his land 3 years before. He felt truly rich. The first frost came early that year, painting the newly planted apple saplings with delicate crystals that caught the morning light like diamonds. Thomas stood at his kitchen window, the same window Rosa had looked through every morning for 42 years, watching his granddaughter Maria chase butterflies through the garden they'd rebuilt together. 6 months had passed since that transformative day when he'd knelt in the courthouse dirt planting seeds with a man who'd once been his enemy. The seasons had turned, the land had healed, and something deeper had taken root in the soil of his heart. Elena appeared in the doorway, carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee, and wearing the kind of peaceful expression Thomas hadn't seen on his daughter's face since she was Maria's age. At 38, she'd finally found the courage to leave her job in Los Angeles and move back home, accepting a position as head nurse at the local hospital. "Papa," she said, settling into the chair beside him, "I got a call from that documentary filmmaker again, the one from New York. She's still hoping you'll reconsider the interview." Thomas accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping his weathered hands around the warm ceramic the way he had every morning for 73 years. The ritual had remained constant, even as everything else in his world had shifted and changed. What would I tell her, mija? That I'm just an old man who got lucky. Elena studied her father's profile, noting the way the morning light softened the lines around his eyes. Is that what you think? That it was just luck? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, watching Maria's joyful dance among the frost-touched flowers. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. No, mi amor, it wasn't luck. It was choice. Every day we choose who we want to be. Most days we choose the easy thing, the safe thing. But sometimes we choose to be brave. And that day in court? That day, I chose to stop being ashamed of who I am. I chose to stop apologizing for taking up space in the world. Elena felt tears threatening behind her eyes. Throughout her childhood, she'd watched her father make himself smaller, quieter, more invisible, as if his very existence was an imposition on a world that barely tolerated his presence. "Papa, do you know what you taught me that day?" Thomas turned to look at his daughter, surprised by the intensity in her voice. "You taught me that dignity isn't something other people give you. It's something you claim for yourself, even when it costs everything." Across town, Harrison Blackwell sat in his modest apartment, reading a letter that had arrived that morning. The return address showed his eldest daughter's name, and the envelope bore the excited scrawl of his 8-year-old grandson across the back. "Grandpa Harry, open this." The letter was brief, but profound. "Dad, I wanted you to know that something has changed in our family since your courthouse incident, as Mom still calls it. Tommy has been asking questions about what it means to do the right thing even when it's hard. Yesterday, he stood up to a bully at school who was picking on a smaller kid. When the teacher asked him why he got involved, he said, 'Because my grandpa Harry taught me that good people don't stay quiet when bad things happen.' I realized I've never been prouder to be your daughter than I am right now. Not because of your career or your accomplishments, but because you finally became the man I always hoped you were inside. Love, Jennifer P.S. Tommy wants to know if you can teach him to plant apple trees like the brave farmer man did." I told him I'd ask. Harrison set down the letter with hands that trembled slightly, feeling something break open in his chest that had been frozen for decades. He thought of Thomas Martinez, kneeling in that reclaimed earth, teaching his granddaughter that patience and hope could grow into something beautiful, given enough time and care. At the local high school, Mrs. Eleanor Patterson stood before her American government class, holding up a newspaper clipping that had yellowed with age. At 63, she'd been teaching for over 30 years, but she'd never had a lesson as powerful as the one unfolding in her own community. "Who can tell me," she asked her 17-year-old students, "what we mean when we talk about justice?" A hand shot up from the back row. "It's when bad people get punished and good people win." Eleanor smiled gently. "That's part of it, Michael. But I want to tell you about something that happened right here in our town. About a man who discovered that sometimes justice isn't something that happens to you. It's something you create through your own courage." She told them about Thomas Martinez, about Judge Blackwell, about the moment when one man's refusal to be silent changed everything. She watched their faces as the story unfolded, seeing the same spark of recognition she'd felt that day in the courthouse. "The lesson isn't that the system worked," Eleanor continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "The lesson is that systems are made of people, and people can choose to be better than they were yesterday." One of her students, a quiet girl named Sarah, whose family had immigrated from Somalia, raised her hand tentatively. "Mrs. Patterson, what if you're scared? What if you don't think anyone will listen to you?" Eleanor felt her heart clench with recognition. She'd been that scared girl once, watching her father struggle against systems designed to keep him invisible. "Then you remember," Eleanor said softly, "that every voice matters, that every act of courage, no matter how small, creates ripples that travel farther than you can imagine." Back on his reclaimed land, Thomas walked slowly through the rows of apple saplings, checking each one for signs of growth, for evidence that his faith in tomorrow had been justified. The trees were small still, barely reaching his waist, but they were alive and growing stronger each day. Maria ran ahead of him, her 7-year-old energy boundless even in the crisp air. She stopped suddenly, kneeling beside one of the smaller trees with the serious expression children reserve for important discoveries. "Abuelo, look, this one has buds already." Thomas knelt beside his granddaughter, examining the tiny green buds that spoke of spring still months away. "Ah, sí, mi amor. That tree, it's eager to grow. Will it have apples this year?" "No, mija. Apple trees, they need patience. Maybe in 3 years we'll see the first fruit. But when they come, they'll be the sweetest apples you ever tasted, because they grew from love." Maria considered this with the gravity of childhood wisdom. "Abuelo, is that why you fought the mean man in the courthouse? For the apple trees?" Thomas felt his breath catch. "How do you explain to a 7-year-old that you fought not for trees, but for the right to plant them? Not for land, but for the dignity to call someplace home? I fought, mi amor, Because some things are too important to lose without a fight. Family, home, the right to plant trees for grandchildren to climb. And truth? Maria added, her voice carrying a solemnity that reminded Thomas powerfully of his son at that age. Especially truth, mija. Truth is like these apple seeds we planted. It might take time to grow, but once it breaks through the soil, nothing can stop it from reaching toward the light. As the sun climbed higher in the winter sky, Thomas felt a presence beside him that had nothing to do with his granddaughter's chatter or the distant sounds of Elena working in the garden. It was Rosa, he knew, and Miguel, and all the generations who'd fought for the simple right to exist with dignity in the world. But more than that, it was the presence of possibility, the knowledge that courage, once awakened, spreads like seeds on the wind, taking root in the most unlikely places, growing into forests of change that shelter generations yet to come. Thomas Martinez had learned something profound in that marble courthouse, something that would echo through his family for generations, that the most powerful thing an ordinary person can do is refuse to accept injustice as inevitable, that sometimes the bravest act is simply standing up and saying, I matter, my life has value, my voice deserves to be heard. And in that simple act of claiming dignity, in that moment of choosing courage over comfort, he discovered a truth more valuable than any settlement, more lasting than any victory. That love, when it finds the courage to speak, can move mountains, can restore faith, can transform enemies into friends and plant seeds of justice that will bloom long after the gardener is gone. As Maria ran toward the house, calling for her mother to come see the apple buds, Thomas remained kneeling in his reclaimed earth, his weathered hands touching the soil that held his past, his present, and the promise of countless tomorrows. He was home, not just on his land, but in his own skin, in his own worth, in the unshakable knowledge that he belonged here as much as anyone ever had, or ever would. And that belonging, that profound, radical acceptance of his own value, was the greatest victory of all.